Charles Darwin and evolution. Born in 1809 and died in 1882. With Charles Darwin, the relationship between man and nature, born of the dichotomy between industry and science, takes on a new face, dramatic and secular. In 1859, Darwin published The Origin of Species, and 12 years later, The Descent of Man. Conflicting with the dogmas of immutable species and a special place for humans in the natural order, Darwin's interpretation of nature and the evolution of life had an exceptional direct ascendancy over Western culture. Although it was controversial at first, the full impact of the theory of evolution was not felt until the 20th century, when it was improved by further advances in the physical sciences. Genetics and microbiology, born from the progress of medicine and physics and sponsored by the theory of evolution, are the legacies left by Darwin for this century. Darwin is arguably the best-known scientist in history, write Adrian Desmond and James Moore, his recent biographers. More than any other modern thinker, including Freud and Marx, this affable old-world naturalist, belonging to the smaller social class of Shropshire, transformed the way we see ourselves on this planet. Charles Robert Darwin was born on 12 February 1809, the fifth child and the youngest of two sons of Robert Waring Darwin, a physician, and Susanna Wedgwood. His paternal grandfather was Erasmus Darwin, 1731 to 1802, a well-known physician, poet, philosopher, and inventor. The mother, Josiah Wedgwood, the famous manufacturer of vases and porcelain. When Darwin was 8 years old, his mother died of gastrointestinal disease, probably cancer. Darwin later said that his sisters forbade him to talk about their mother after her death, and so he remembered little of her. Sent to Shrewsbury School, a prestigious private school run by Samuel Butler, he detested the curriculum, with a strong emphasis on the classics. Darwin had difficulty learning languages. However, outside the classroom, he was interested in natural history and collecting plants and animals. The passion for collecting, he wrote in his autobiography, which leads one to be a systematic naturalist, a virtuoso, or a miser, was very strong and clearly intuitive, for none of my brothers or sisters ever possessed it. Darwin remembered his father, the chief physician at Shrewsbury, with admiration, but others deep down thought he was a tyrant, though benevolent. Like Robert Darwin, Charles initially planned to study medicine and began attending the University of Edinburgh in 1825. The following year, he joined the Plinian Society of Natural History and came under the influence of Robert Grant, a well-known physician and zoologist. With regard to his medical studies, however, Darwin showed that he did not like it. He particularly hated anatomy, much to his regret later, because he never learned to dissect. It also became clear that he was sensitive to human suffering and could not observe the operations, which were done at that time without anesthetic. Darwin's ambivalence about choosing a career led him to an unusual and critical result in the history of science. When Darwin's doubts about becoming a doctor came to his father's attention, he suggested that he become a religious man. Darwin dutifully left Edinburgh in 1827 and enrolled at Christ College, Cambridge University. There, his time was wasted, as he later claimed. However, he studied with the botanist John Stephen Henslow, collected beetles, and graduated in 1831. Soon after, he was offered the position of naturalist on the ship that would make a circumnavigation of the globe. The young captain of the HMS Beagle, Robert Fitzroy, wanted a young, good family companion, as it was to be a long and probably tedious voyage. Its purpose was to reconnoiter the coast of the land of Loco and the coast of Chile and Peru, and to visit the islands of the South Seas and the archipelago of the Indies. Darwin's name was proposed by his teacher Henslow as being, quote, widely qualified to collect, observe, and annotate. Overcoming his father's objections, Darwin was aboard the Beagle when it set sail on December 27, 1831. he would not return to England for 5 years. In popular science literature, Darwin's voyage on the Beagle has a special place, sometimes told as an adventure in which Darwin is portrayed as a physically vigorous, adventurous man of a brave, inventive, and diligent spirit when in difficulty, and constantly driven beyond the limits of his natural environment by some unknown impulse.
In fact, the Beagle anchored in Montevideo when the country was in the midst of a revolution, and Darwin crossed the Pampas on horseback, writing to his sister, "I have become almost a gaucho, drink the mate and smoke the cigar, and lie down to sleep as comfortably as on a feather bed, with the firmament as a canopy." Darwin also had seasickness problems throughout the voyage and was very homesick.
The theory of common descent made a great impact. Of greater significance, however, is the fact that Darwin seized an unusual opportunity to absorb raw material within the context of the historical intellectual activity of the natural sciences. Initially, his primary interest was geology, and the great influence on him was from Charles Lyell, whose then published work, Principles of Geology, he had read with interest during the voyage.
Darwin also collected specimens of flora and fauna. He used field notebooks to write his observations, expanded in the form of a diary. He noted with interest the small differences between the populations of birds and turtles on the islands neighboring the Galápagos. He also felt that his ability to observe improved. "I have always thought that I owe to this trip the first real training or education of my mind," he later wrote. "I was led to closely examine the various branches of natural history, and thus my capacity as an observer was improved, although it was already well developed." The Beagle returned to England on October 20, 1836. In 1837, still under the intellectual impact of the voyage, Darwin began to sketch out the theoretical product of the massive observations. And in 1838, while reading Malthus, he conceived the idea of natural selection as the conservation of certain features through adaptation to the conditions of life. However, he did not publish his theory at that time and continued to accumulate data. He has published 3 scientific papers with his observations of coral reefs, volcanic islands, and other geological formations. These articles gave Darwin a solid professional reputation.
At Down House, outside the limits of London, where Darwin had lived since 1842, he dedicated the years from 1846 to 1854 to a systematic research on the structure of barnacles, the undesirable crustaceans that are distributed all over the world by encrusting themselves in the hulls of ships. He made a third draft of his theory in 1856, but under pressure from Charles Lyell, now a personal friend, he refused to publish it. On the other hand, Darwin was anxious to establish a priority for his scientific ideas, but believed that only a theoretical presentation, supported by a gigantic amount of facts, would be appropriate.
In 1858, Alfred Wallace, an amateur naturalist who had also traveled to South America, sent Darwin a remarkably clear exposition of the theory of the formation of species, which compelled him to bring his own ideas to the public. Separate papers by Darwin and Wallace were read before the Linnean Society, and Darwin's ascendancy was established. The following year saw the publication of his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. The Origin had an immediate and controversial impact on scientists, on readers in general, and on theologians. The most famous happened at a meeting of the British Association, where the Bishop of Oxford, who was ignorant of Darwin's theory, nevertheless ridiculed it. The bishop was silenced by Thomas Huxley, sometimes called Darwin's bulldog, who declared that he would rather be akin to an ape than to be a man of proven ability who used his brain to pervert the truth. As with Copernicus's revolution and Freud's hypothesis about the unconscious mind, Darwin's work was so powerful that it exerted great influence long before any experimental proof. In fact, Darwin's reluctance to publish The Origin is easy to understand, for not even the rules and even the mechanisms of heredity were not clear at that time. If trends were mixed, As biologists originally believed, why shouldn't individual adaptations be diluted and destined to disappear in a few generations?
This problem preoccupied Darwin to such an extent that he was led to adapt a quasi-Lamarckian solution known as pangenesis towards the end of his life. The physical explanation of heredity and natural selection would have to wait for the discovery of chromosomes, the rediscovery of Gregor Mendel, and the work of geneticists. Half a century separates the publication of The Origin from the explanation of genetic heredity made by Thomas Hunt Morgan.
After The Origin, Darwin published about 10 books on the theory of natural selection. Among them, The Descent of Man in 1871, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals the following year, and The Power of Motion in Plants in 1880. Darwin's personal life has been much studied, and his idiosyncrasies much debated. In 1839, he married a first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, who bore him 10 children, 7 of whom lived to adulthood.
For much of the end of his life, Darwin suffered from an illness, the diagnosis of which is not very clear and which may have been psychosomatic. When he wrote Origin, Darwin was an atheist. Later, he became an agnostic. When he died on 19 April 1882, he was buried at Westminster Abbey, near Isaac Newton.
Charles Darwin, because of his great influence on human thought, must be distinguished among the great men of science: Aristotle, Galileo, Newton, Lavoisier, and Einstein. So wrote A.E.E. Mackenzie in his classic work of history, The Greatest Achievements of Science, published a generation ago. Nothing has happened since then to change this point of view.
Like Freudian thought, Darwinism also allows for a quicker and more painful investigation than physical one of personal and social prejudices, and with a whole variety of social consequences. Thus, controversy became one of its most constant and most developed characteristics. Despite this, Charles Darwin, as George Gaylord Simpson wrote, is the genius who, though fallible like all of us, revolutionized scientific scrutiny and knowledge of our origins, as well as our physical relationship to nature and the universe.